Great to have you along for the ride. Thanks a lot for stopping by. Glad to have this man back. It's Dr. Scott Jensen, family physician, former Minnesota governor candidate against Tim Walz, and all-around great guy. How are you, Doc? Good to see you.
I'm doing great, Joe. Thanks for having me on.
You're very welcome. It's a pleasure to have you back on. I wasn't happy that you didn't win, and I think that you should have won. We're seeing where Tim Walz, as the governor, blew an $18 billion surplus. He's a guy who has done the most radical things possible while trying to pretend like he's your folksy Uncle Tim, who's the coach of the football team, and he's just a good old dad who's a military veteran who fought in war. And a lot of those things just aren't true. But we talked just briefly before we started today, and I want to start where you started. You lost against Tim Walz. Why?
We lost because of the Roe v. Wade issue.
Can you imagine?
Not an issue. That was not an issue until the Supreme Court in June of 2022 decided to reverse a previous decision in 73. And between the Roe v. Wade reversal and the mainstream media in Minnesota deciding to serve as Tim Walz's protection, his shield, those two things were insurmountable. Tim Walz is used to having the media protect and guard him when he makes foolish comments or when he quits on something or he doesn't lead. And I've said over and over again, Tim Walz is a Teflon politician. Nothing sticks. I mean, he can quit on the National Guard and not complete his service contract. He can quit on the National Guard by not calling them forward in the riots in May of 2020 and then referring to them as a bunch of 19-year-old cooks. He can quit on the cops. He can quit on the kids. He can quit on the churches, but it's always someone else. And I think that Teflon nature is what's allowed him to rise meteorically to, if you will, the national stage. But make no question about it, he is Teflon. And honestly, on the issues, you're not going to hear many solutions from him. You're going to hear sort of a vacuum, but you will always see the media in Minnesota shield him and protect him.
It is Dr. Scott Jensen. Go and follow him, drscottjensen.com. I want to focus on the abortion issue a little bit because from what I'm getting from you, conservatives are not handling the issue correctly. Now, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, I think that was appropriate via the Constitution. You probably agree, but I think that our side doesn't handle it right. What I mean is, it is not a federal issue. It's a state's issue. Always has been. Abortion is not in the Constitution. 10th Amendment says anything that's not here goes back to the states. That was a correct decision, but is it that so many conservatives are saying, never abortion, period, end of story, and pro-life 100%? I don't care what your feelings are. Is that the issue?
I think you made a very good point, Joe. It was a good decision by the U.S. Supreme Court. Democrats and Republicans, if you will, liberals and conservatives in terms of justices have said that for decades. Ruth Bader Ginsburg said the same thing. The Rehnquist court considered reversing it. So now that we have this situation, I think what Republicans and pro-life people have to recognize that in a state like Minnesota, 70% of people believe that some access should be preserved. Right. We have 7 out of 7 Supreme Court justices in our Minnesota court are all liberally leaning. They've already said that, no, it is a preserved access point. It has been legislated all the way to the point of delivery. What we need to do as people who are personally pro-life is we've got to say, well, don't we all want to reduce the number of abortions? Let's do a better job of making birth control available. Let's streamline adoption. Let's do a better job with natural family planning. Let's come alongside of women and say, listen, nobody wants to have someone else's moral code imposed on another. Women can make good, thoughtful decisions on their own. We don't need to have this as a legislated issue. What we need to do is say, what is our mission? And if our mission is to save lives, then let's go do it by more effective family planning, have birth control available out there, have streamline of adoption. We can do those things and we can stop this issue from taking all the oxygen out of the room, because meanwhile, our country's losing its soul when it comes to inflation, crime, education, energy independence, corporate protection, corporate responsibility. When it comes to these things, immigrants, we're not paying any attention because people are so wrapped up in this one issue, and we cannot afford to do that.
Well, how do you get rid of it? It's Dr. Scott Jensen, because you and I agree that the vast majority of every human being on the planet wants fewer abortions. I think that we would agree most human beings on the planet don't want late-term or partial birth abortion. I think that we would agree that what Tim Walz put in place in Minnesota, if the baby survives a botched abortion, you just let it die. I think they would be against that, most people. So how do we handle it better? Now that you've got the knowledge that you gained while running for governor, and you've already told me that you would have done it differently on that issue at least, how do we change the narrative? What do we say? President Trump right now is saying, I believe in the three exceptions, rape, incest, and the mother's life. So I think most people agree with that. Even Ronald Reagan agreed to that. I think I agree with that. You probably agree with that. Do we just go there? How do we handle it? Because Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are saying Jensen and Trump and PAGS all want an abortion ban.
I think we say we're absolutely not interested in an abortion ban. What we're interested in is honoring our personal position, which is pro-life, and we can recognize that while that's our personal position, from a policy perspective, it's going to be one of the basic American tenets of our democratic republic, and that is that the majority rules. So you're going to have some states that will be more conservative, and you'll have other states that will be more liberal. In Minnesota, 70% of people think that some access to abortion should be preserved. But also, probably about 60% do not like the idea of elective third trimester abortions. Now, on the other hand, the Republicans oftentimes point to the third trimester and say, this is unconscionable. Okay, but let's be reasonable about it. In some years, I think maybe 2022, there might have been one elective abortion in the state of Minnesota during the entire year that was truly an elective third trimester abortion. Wow. So let's quit quibbling about it, and let's recognize that not just Scott Jensen or Joe Pags are reanalyzing our perspective on this. Not just us are experiencing an evolution of our perspective on this. Millions of Americans have done this. I have met with people from across the country, Joe, and I went specifically to a group of people from Kansas, and I said, in August of 2022, you had the opportunity to ban abortion. You are a red state. You are a pro-life state. You could have banned abortion, and yet you voted almost 60 to 40 to not. What happened? And those people told me, and there's a bunch of people between the ages of 30 and 60, they said, we're pro-life. But when it comes to us imposing our moral code on someone else, we're not comfortable with it. We still think that where many states like Minnesota have gone is over the top.
Yeah.
But the fact is, I think Americans are starting to say, listen, when it comes to legislating, we have to recognize that some issues aren't really legislatable. Let's legislate on issues like inflation, crime, education, energy, immigrant policies, and things like this. But when it comes to privacy, when it comes to the bedroom, when it comes to some of these personal moral code issues, we are going to have to recognize that truly the Republican Party has been the party of limited government. Then let's be the party of limited government.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And the attacks on J.D. Vance right now from people like Tim Walz are that J.D. Vance wants 10-year-olds to give birth. And he's never said that. That's just stupid. But it's the way that they're twisting it, and they're better communicators than Republicans are, generally speaking. It's getting through. I had somebody literally send me an email. I love your show. I'm a conservative. Does J.D. Vance really want 10-year-olds to have babies? No, he doesn't want 10-year-olds to have babies. That's stupid. But they're hearing what Walz and what Harris are saying. It's Dr. Scott Jensen, family physician, former Minnesota governor candidate. Wish you would have won. I appreciate the continued access. Has the stolen valor stuff been known about Tim Walz for years in Minnesota? I don't live there, but I love being on there. Several stations, as you know. Has it always been known, or is this just now coming out because she selected him to be on the ticket?
In 2018, when Tim Walz ran for the open governor's seat against Jeff Johnson tried to bring it up. In 2022, when I ran, we brought it up, and the Minnesota Star Tribune, the mainstream media, didn't go after the issue at all. They didn't dig into that at all. They just went after me and said, well, did you serve Dr. Jensen? And I said, no, I was prepared to. I had been notified that I would be drafted most likely in the spring of 1973 until Henry Kissinger negotiated a ceasefire in January of 73, and the draft went away.
Right.
The bottom line was we did raise this issue. And we were excoriated because we had the gall to question Tim Walz's service. Now, going forward, if you look at the Gen Xers, Joe, probably 90% of Gen Xers have not served in the military because there's been no draft.
Right.
So are we to say that in the public square going forward, that all of these Gen Xers are eliminated from having the right to discuss and question the nature of someone's service? What we have said about Tim Walz is He quit before he completed his contract of service that he signed in 2001 for 6 years. He quit before he completed the responsibilities of the E9 promotion he had gotten as a sergeant major. He quit even though he told the public that he felt that in 2005, if his troops got deployed, that he needed to be there to lead. He quit on that. He quit on the National Guard in 2020 when he didn't call them forward to stop the burning and, if you will, thuggery of Minneapolis, when he said that the National Guard is not well-trained, mission-oriented people, but rather 19-year-old cooks. That's all we said. We did not ever denigrate the 24 years of service he gave. We appreciate it very much. But the bottom line is Tim Walz has been guilty of, through word salad and misrepresentation of what he actually did, he's been guilty of embellishing to a degree that's not acceptable. Right. J.D. Vance, on the other hand, has very appropriately identified what he's done and what he hasn't done. He has not felt a need to claim something that he didn't do. Tim Walz talked about weapons of war that he carried in war. He never was in war.
Right.
J.D. Vance has been very reasonable, and he's been a patriot for our country. And I'd say one other thing, Joe, about J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance is not interested in having 10-year-olds deliver babies. What he's interested in is having 10-year-olds have an access point and an obligation to be and work with their parents. This idea of the loss of parental freedom in the midst of this abortion discussion is simply, it's an absolute undercutting of parental rights. Parents have financial responsibility for their kids till they're 18. The notion that kids can go through and have major surgeries or huge impact decisions without having their parents involved because government officials want to take parents out of the equation, J.D. Vance protests against that, and so do I.
Yeah, and I do as well. I think most people who are reasonable do as well. It's Dr. Scott Jensen. Just a little bit of background. I am Gen X. I'm older Gen X, but I'm Gen X. I didn't serve. Almost did. Almost Army Blues Band. Didn't go. My dad served in the Air Force. He gave me the ability to not serve if I didn't want to. I did sign up for the selective service like everybody else had to. Had I been drafted, I would have gone. Having said all of that, to tell me I can't criticize Tim Walz for his lies, you're nicer than I am. He's a liar. The guy's lying. I've got the timeline from Tom Behrens. I had him on the other night, the CSM who actually took that unit to Iraq. He went through the timeline. Walz knew in March that they were going to be deployed at some point. Then he decided to drop out in May before the actual orders came in July. The timeline is clear. He knew they were going to go. He decided not to go. And he was supposed to get out September 2007. He decided to leave in May of 2005. What you've said is true. I'm just giving the timeline that others are lying about. Having said all of that, if I go to the doctor and he says I have to have my appendix out, and it turns out he took out my appendix, but my problem was really in my liver, am I a non-doctor not allowed to say, oh, you made a mistake, you did something wrong? I mean, can he say, you're not a doctor, don't worry about it. It doesn't matter if I told the truth or didn't tell the truth or made a mistake or didn't make a mistake. The fact that you're not a doctor excludes you. Not in this country. I mean, doc, at what point do we stop having the ability to have an opinion about something?
I think that's exactly right. And that's a great example. And I think we just lived through 4 years of COVID pandemic, where what we really saw, Joe, in so many ways, the people with PhD and MD behind their name, they were not the voices of clarity. They were not the voices of insight. They were not the voices of scrutiny during the COVID pandemic. Frequently, they were the lemmings marching to the sea. It was the everyday person that was rolling up their sleeves, digging in and saying, hey, something isn't passing the smell test here. Thank goodness for the fact that people did say, I don't need to be a doctor or a scientist or a PhD to understand that something's terribly wrong. I remember, Joe, when it was insurance executives that pointed out the warning sign of what was happening with the all-cause mortality going up. We were seeing an all-cause mortality blip like we should never have seen. And you weren't hearing about this from physicians or from Tony Fauci or from the CDC. You heard about this from insurance executives, engineers, everyday people who said, this is wrong. The timeline doesn't work. It wasn't the COVID disease that caused the most problems. It was how we responded to it. It was how we squashed kids, stopped schools, locked them down, undercut the role of cops and soldiers. We absolutely ignored science. It was our response that killed so many Americans.
Yes. No, I couldn't agree more. The fact that we weren't allowed to say hydroxychloroquine works, which does, or ivermectin works, which does, monoclonal antibodies, they do. The others, the shots have adverse effects we weren't allowed to talk about. So all of that was horrible for the American public. But as I said earlier, the left always controls the messaging better than we do. So let's get back to the campaign and let's finish on this. And I want to have you back very soon because I know they're still trying to persecute you for no reason. And I thank God that you've risen above most or all of it. Having said that, Republicans are right now the Trump campaign literally is going after the personalities on the left. I think that's a mistake. I think they should go, like you said about abortion, go after the issue, attack the issue, be strong on the issue. Do you agree with me that they can't really play personality politics because Megan Thee Stallion is not showing up for Donald Trump, and having a concert in Las Vegas to make it look like a big campaign rally is not happening for Donald Trump? Do you think they should focus more on the issues and less on the personalities?
I could not agree with you more, Joe. There is no reason to do the name calling. I don't care if Kamala Harris had a black parent and an Indian parent. This doesn't matter to me. I don't want the name calling. I want Donald Trump to talk about what he did when he was president and what he's going to do. I want him to talk about the economy. I want him to talk about the risk and the danger when you don't have secure borders. I want him to help Americans understand that when we get involved as a policeman around the world, devoting potentially lives, dollars, and shortchanging our own veterans in our own land, we're on fraught ground. We don't need to go on the attack. Donald Trump has brought a vigor and an energy to American politics that we haven't seen in decades. We don't have to quibble about the size of the rallies. What we do need to do is we need to say, Donald Trump, show us your human side. We know you're a powerful leader. We know you were raised in a rough and tough rumble of New York business. But there's an awful lot of people out here that just want to know the tender side. We want to know what you did, what you're going to do. Kamala Harris had, if you will, the opportunity to do something substantive with immigration, with the southern border, with the economy, and she didn't do it. And Joe, I would ask this. How long did Kamala Harris realize that Joe Biden was not fit for another term as president? And if she was aware of that, and Tim Walz flew out to Washington, D.C., spent 45 minutes with Biden in a conference, and comes out and says he's fit for service. Well, I'm glad to hear that Tim Walz is qualified to determine at what level cognitive loss is meaningful. Yeah. This is what we need to be talking about. We do not need to be talking about character assassination or identity politics.
It's Dr. Scott Jensen. Go to drscottjensen.com. It's drscottjensen.com. Follow him everywhere as well. Doc, thanks a lot for coming back on. We've got to do it again very soon. This is going to be a hot race, okay?
Thank you much.
All right, brother. We're back after this. Stay right here.